She was only 15 years old when the world as she knew it collapsed. A teenager, with dreams as ordinary as anyone's, and a smile that seemed to light up every room she entered. Her name was Mary Vincent, and in the late summer of 1978, she was a runaway with no more than youthful defiance, restless energy, and a need to be free. What she could not have known, what she could never have imagined, was that she would soon become a name remembered not for her disappearance, but for her unimaginable survival. The photograph you see here captures a moment long after that night. A moment when Mary stood, smiling bravely, showing to the world that she was still here. But if you look closely, you will notice something extraordinary. Her arms, gone. In their place, crude mechanical hooks. A reminder of the violence she endured, and yet, proof of the strength she carried inside her. This is not just the story of a crime. It is not just the story of one girl's tragedy. It is the story of resilience, of the human will refusing to bow to cruelty. It is about Mary Vincent, the girl who would not let herself disappear. In the late 1970s, America was a country caught between eras. Freedom and rebellion defined the culture. Young people hitchhiked, ran away, sought adventure. The open road felt like possibility, but it was also dangerous. And for Mary, who had run away from home in California, danger was waiting in the most unsuspecting form. Mary's childhood had been ordinary in some ways, turbulent in others. She was one of 7 children, a bright young girl who loved to dance, to draw, to move. But at 15, she was restless. Her parents' marriage had ended in divorce, and like many teenagers in fractured families, Mary longed for escape. One day, she left home, chasing independence, hoping for something more than the arguments and instability she knew. She had no idea that her decision to run away would intersect with the path of a man whose cruelty would leave her forever marked, but never broken. On September 29, 1978, Mary was standing on the side of the road, exhausted, holding a handmade sign. She wanted to reach Los Angeles. She wanted to get back to her grandfather's house after running away. She was tired, hungry, and scared, but determined. And then, a van pulled over. Behind the wheel was an older man. His name was Lawrence Singleton. To Mary, he looked harmless enough. A grandfatherly figure, offering kindness when she needed it most. Other drivers had passed her by, but Singleton stopped. He told her he had a daughter her age, and he couldn't leave a young girl alone on the highway. He said he would take her where she needed to go. At first, it felt like salvation. But in truth, it was the beginning of her nightmare. There are moments in life that split time into before and after. For Mary Vincent, climbing into that van was one of those moments. What followed was an act of brutality so shocking that newspapers across the nation would later struggle to print it. Yet Mary survived it. She survived it with a will so fierce, so relentless, that her name has never been forgotten. She was taken, assaulted, and mutilated by the man who had pretended to help her. In an act of cruelty beyond comprehension, he cut off her arms and left her in a canyon, certain that she would bleed to death and disappear into the earth. But Mary did not disappear. Bleeding, broken, and barely alive, she made a choice. She chose to crawl. She chose to stand. She chose to live. Step by agonizing step, she dragged herself out of the canyon, leaving behind a trail of blood, but also a trail of defiance. She stumbled onto a road where a couple in a car, horrified and stunned, saw a teenager walking, her arms gone, her eyes filled with fire, refusing to collapse. She should have died that day. Every odd was against her. But Mary Vincent lived. And not only did she live, she remembered. She gave police a description so precise, so powerful, that the man who tried to erase her existence could not hide. Lawrence Singleton was arrested. He was put on trial. And thanks to Mary's courage, the world would know his name not as a fatherly rescuer, but as a monster. But Mary's story does not end there. because surviving is not the same as living. And for Mary Vincent, the years that followed were filled with struggles just as real as that canyon floor. She faced nightmares, endless surgeries, the cruelty of a legal system that did not always value victims, and the haunting knowledge that her attacker would one day walk free. Yet somehow, she kept going. The photo you see is not just a portrait. It is a statement. Mary Vincent, standing in 1978, with the prosthetic hooks she learned to use, smiling in defiance. A smile that says, "You did not win. I am still here." Her story is one of survival, but also of warning. It is about trust, danger, and the strength of the human will. But above all, it is about a young girl who refused to let a cruel man decide her ending. This is only the beginning of Mary's story. And as we dive deeper into her life, into the trial, into the years after her survival, we will see not only the scars she carried, but the incredible strength with which she lived. Mary Vincent did not disappear. She became unforgettable. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary scene. A teenager, tired from the road, grateful for a ride. An older man, seemingly kind. A fatherly figure with wrinkles of experience carved into his face. To anyone driving past that highway in California on September 29, 1978, there was nothing unusual. But history was being written in that moment. Mary Vincent climbed into the van, still holding on to her dreams of reaching Los Angeles. She sat there, her young face lit with cautious relief, believing she had escaped the uncertainty of hitchhiking alone. She had no way of knowing that she had just stepped into the lair of a predator. Lawrence Singleton, the man behind the wheel, was 51 years old. On paper, he was nothing extraordinary, a divorced father, a man with a quiet presence. But behind that calm exterior was something much darker. He had lived a life filled with bitterness, rejection, and anger. To Mary, though he seemed safe, he told her stories about his life, talked about his daughter, and played the part of a concerned stranger who just wanted to help a young girl. For a while, Mary believed him. She relaxed. She thought she had found someone she could trust. But small details began to break the illusion. As they drove, Mary noticed that he was not taking the correct route. Her instincts screamed at her that something was wrong. She confronted him, telling him that he was going the wrong way, that she needed to get to Los Angeles. Singleton smiled, his voice calm, assuring her that he knew a shortcut, that he would get her there faster. It was a lie, but Mary, 15 and desperate, had no choice but to believe him. The road stretched on. The sun began to set. With every mile, Mary was being pulled further from safety, deeper into danger. At one point, Singleton stopped the van, claiming he needed to use the bathroom. Mary, exhausted, stepped outside too. It was then, for just a second, that she bent down to tie her shoe. That small act, innocent, ordinary, was the moment Singleton struck. When Mary looked up, the mask had slipped. The fatherly rescuer was gone. In his place was a predator whose intentions were no longer hidden. The details of what followed have been told and retold, always with a shiver of disbelief. Singleton overpowered her, binding her with cruelty and dragging her deeper into a nightmare she had never imagined. Mary fought with every ounce of strength her young body carried. But she was only 15, and he was a grown man filled with rage. But perhaps the most terrifying moment was not the attack itself. It was what came after, because Singleton, in his twisted mind, believed that letting her go would mean being caught. And so, in a decision as cold as steel, he chose to silence her. Not by hiding her, not by threatening her, but by doing something almost unthinkable. He took her arms. With a hatchet, he severed her left arm, then her right. Mary, screaming, fell into a blur of pain so immense that most would have slipped into unconsciousness and never returned. But she did not faint. She did not give in. In that moment, when most would have surrendered to death, Mary's survival instincts ignited. Her mind screamed at her, "You cannot fall. You cannot stop. You must live." Singleton carried her body, bleeding and broken, and dumped her into a canyon, believing that he had finished the job. To him, Mary was no longer a person. She was evidence he needed to erase. He left her there, certain she would die. Then he drove away. But what Singleton did not understand was that Mary Vincent was not ordinary. She was a fighter. Somehow, with blood pouring from wounds no human being should survive, Mary forced herself to stand. The world around her blurred, the pain unbearable, but she refused to collapse. She pressed the stumps of her arms into the dirt, creating pressure to slow the bleeding. It was an instinct born of desperation, a knowledge that came not from training, but from an unshakable will to live. Step by step, she climbed out of the canyon. Every move was agony. Every second was a battle. But Mary kept telling herself, "I cannot die. I have to live. I cannot let him win." And then, against every odd, she reached the highway. Imagine the sight: a 15-year-old girl, covered in blood, her arms gone, stumbling forward under the weight of survival. Drivers passed by in shock, afraid, unsure of what they were seeing. But then, finally, one couple stopped. They saw not just a broken girl, but a warrior who had clawed her way back from death. Mary collapsed into their arms, but she did not let go of her determination. She told them who she was. She told them what happened. And most importantly, she told them about the man who had done it. Mary Vincent's story could have ended in that canyon, but it didn't. It survived, carried in her voice, in her memory, and in her will to bring justice. This was not the end of her nightmare, but it was the beginning of her fight. Because Mary had survived something most people could not even imagine. And now, with every ounce of strength left in her, she was ready to face the next chapter. Telling the world exactly what happened and refusing to let her attacker vanish into the shadows. When the ambulance doors closed behind her, Mary Vincent was no longer just a runaway teenager. She was a survivor fighting against time. Her body was failing, her blood dangerously low, and her chances of survival, according to doctors later, were slim to none. Yet somehow, against every medical expectation, she clung to life. The hospital staff could not believe what they saw. A girl, only 15, who had walked herself out of a canyon after losing both arms. It was something that defied logic, something that spoke to a strength beyond the physical. As surgeons rushed her into the operating room, they knew they were not just fighting to save a life. They were witnessing a miracle in progress. Hours of surgery followed. Blood transfusions, stitches, emergency procedures, all to stabilize the young girl who had already proven that she was stronger than death itself. But while doctors worked on her body, Mary's mind was already locked on one goal: to make sure the man who did this would not escape justice. Lying in a hospital bed, bandaged and broken, Mary Vincent did something extraordinary. She remembered every detail: the lines on his face, the way he spoke, the van he drove. Even in the haze of trauma, she held on to those images with a clarity that stunned investigators. Detectives arrived at her bedside, unsure of what she would be able to tell them. Many victims in her situation would have been too traumatized, too weak, too lost in shock to provide useful details. But not Mary. When the officers asked if she could describe her attacker, she did not hesitate. Her voice was steady. She described his age, his build, his hairline, his mannerisms. She even recalled small details, like the way he smoked, the wrinkles near his eyes. It was as if her mind had burned his image into memory, refusing to let it fade. And then came the moment that stunned even seasoned investigators. Mary Vincent, still in her hospital bed, picked up a pencil with her toes and sketched. Without arms, she drew his face. That drawing, combined with her vivid description, led police straight to him. Lawrence Singleton. The arrest was swift. When Singleton was confronted, he tried to deny everything, playing the role of the misunderstood father figure. But Mary's testimony was too sharp, too precise. She had seen his face in her nightmares, and now she forced the world to see it too. But survival was only the first battle. Justice would be the next. Mary's presence in the courtroom months later was something few who attended would ever forget. She walked in, still a teenager, her prosthetic hooks replacing her lost arms, her body frail but her spirit unshaken. The jury watched as this young girl stood before them, refusing to hide her scars, refusing to let Singleton erase her truth. Every word she spoke was a blow against the man who had tried to silence her. She pointed at him, identified him without fear, and told the court exactly what he had done. It was devastating. It was powerful. It was undeniable. And it worked. Singleton was convicted of attempted murder, kidnapping, and other charges. But here came the twist that would shake Mary to her core. Under California law at the time, the maximum sentence for his crimes was just 14 years. 14. For taking her arms. For nearly taking her life. For shattering her world. Mary could not believe it. Neither could the public. Newspapers screamed about the injustice, about how a man so cruel could serve less time than it takes most people to finish college. But the law was the law. Singleton would serve just over half of that sentence, only 8 years, before walking free. For Mary, this was a wound deeper than the ones carved into her body. She had survived the canyon, survived the surgeries, survived the courtroom, but the system that was supposed to protect her had let him slip through its fingers. And this was not the end of her connection to Singleton, not even close, because when he walked out of prison, years later, Mary Vincent's nightmare was not over. It was only beginning again. But for now, in those first years after her attack, Mary focused on something that mattered even more than the courtroom: learning to live again. Her family surrounded her, doctors fitted her with prosthetics, and slowly she began to rebuild her life. Dancing, drawing, even smiling, Mary found ways to reclaim pieces of the girl she had been. And yet, no matter how strong she became, a shadow followed her. The knowledge that the man who had done this was still out there, waiting. This was the cruel paradox of Mary's survival. She had beaten death, but she could not escape the fear that her attacker might return. The story of Mary Vincent was far from over. In fact, the most shocking chapters had yet to be written. Because when Lawrence Singleton walked free after serving less than a decade behind bars, the world would see that some monsters don't stay in cages. For most people, survival would have been the ending. To live after the unthinkable would have been enough. But for Mary Vincent, survival was only the beginning. She was 15 years old, her body forever changed, her innocence stolen, and yet the world expected her to move forward. Doctors marveled at her determination, her ability to learn quickly, to adapt. Within months, she was fitted with prosthetic arms, metal hooks at the end of heavy harnesses. They were crude, far from natural, but to Mary, they were freedom. Imagine trying to eat, to dress, to brush your hair, with no arms. Every small act became a mountain to climb. But Mary did not stop climbing. Day after day, she practiced. She learned how to write again, gripping a pen between the steel hooks. She learned how to cook, to sew, even to draw, the very thing she loved most before her life had been torn apart. Every attempt was painful, frustrating, but every success was a declaration: "You didn't destroy me. I am still here." And yet, while she was fighting to rebuild her life, a darker truth haunted her. The man who had done this, the man who had tried to erase her, would one day walk free. The courts had decided. 14 years, reduced even further for good behavior. 8 years, maybe less, and he would be back on the streets. Mary was terrified. Every night, when she closed her eyes, she saw his face. The face she had sketched from her hospital bed. The face she had pointed to in the courtroom. The face of the man who had left her to die. She wondered if he would come back for her, if he would finish what he started. And she was not alone in that fear. Across California, across the country, people read her story and asked, "How can this be justice? How can a man who did this serve so little time? Mary Vincent had survived the canyon, the hospital, and the courtroom. But now she was living in a different kind of prison, a prison of fear. Still, she refused to let that fear control her. She went back to school. She reconnected with her family. She began to dream again, though the dreams looked different now. No longer the carefree visions of a dancer or an artist, but the dreams of a fighter, a survivor, a woman determined to create a life out of the ashes of her past. And there was something else that gave Mary strength, the people around her. Strangers who wrote letters of support, neighbors who saw not a victim, but a hero, teachers who marveled at her courage. Each word, each gesture, reminded Mary that she was not alone. But the truth was, no matter how far she came, she could never fully escape what had happened. The scars were not just on her body. They lived in her mind, in her heart. Every time she walked past a stranger, she wondered, could this person hurt me too? Every time she saw a van drive by, her body stiffened, her breath caught. Trauma had become her shadow. Still, Mary Vincent found ways to rise above it. One day, she stood in front of a mirror, looked at her reflection, and made a choice. She would not hide. She would not let her prosthetics define her. She would face the world exactly as she was, a survivor. And slowly, her courage became contagious. Newspapers that once reported her as a victim now called her an inspiration. Communities invited her to speak, to share her story, to remind people that resilience is stronger than cruelty. But even as she inspired others, Mary's private battle continued. Because she knew the clock was ticking, she knew that Singleton would one day leave prison. And when that day came, her life would once again hang in the balance. This looming threat was the cruelest twist of all. She had beaten him once, but would she have to fight again? For now, Mary focused on reclaiming pieces of her life. She poured herself into art, sketching and painting despite the limitations of her hooks. Her drawings carried a new depth, a rawness that spoke of both pain and triumph. Every line was a form of therapy, every sketch a reminder that her spirit was still alive. But Mary was not just rebuilding herself. She was preparing for the day the world would release her attacker, preparing for the moment when she might once again feel his shadow looming over her. And when that day finally came, when Lawrence Singleton stepped out of prison after serving less than a decade, Mary Vincent's greatest test was not behind her. It was standing just ahead. Because some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Some nightmares follow you. And Mary was about to learn that surviving once was not enough. She would have to find the strength to survive all over again. The day finally came. The day Mary Vincent had feared since the moment she learned her attacker's sentence. 8 short years. That's all it took for the man who had nearly killed her to step out of prison and back into the world. When the news broke, people across California were stunned. How could it be possible? How could a man who had committed such brutality be allowed to walk free while the girl he attacked would carry scars for the rest of her life? But the law was the law, and in 1987, Lawrence Singleton was released from prison. For Mary, it was like being thrown back into that canyon. Her body trembled, her heart raced, her nights filled with nightmares. She had rebuilt her life, step by fragile step, and now it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her again. Singleton's release didn't just terrify Mary, it terrified everyone. Communities across California protested, outraged that such a man could live among them. Wherever officials tried to settle him, towns erupted in anger. People held signs, gathered in front yards, demanding, "Not here. Not in our city. Not near our children." The public understood something the justice system had ignored. Some crimes cannot be undone, and some people cannot be trusted to walk free. Meanwhile, Mary Vincent, barely in her 20s, was forced to live with the knowledge that the man who had stolen her arms, her childhood, her peace, was once again out there. She carried a fear most of us cannot imagine, the fear that one day she would turn a corner and he would be there. That one night, a knock at the door would bring her face to face with the nightmare she had barely survived. And here was the cruelest part. Mary did not have the power to stop it. The system that had failed her once was failing her again. But if there was one thing Mary had learned since that night in 1978, it was this: fear could not be allowed to win. She refused to disappear into the shadows. Instead, she spoke louder. She told her story publicly, forcing the world to remember. She became not just a survivor, but a voice for herself, and for every victim who had been silenced by fear. Every time she stood in front of a crowd, every time she shared her truth, Mary reminded people that justice wasn't just about laws. It was about humanity, about making sure no one else would have to endure what she had lived through. But as Mary found her voice, Lawrence Singleton proved the fears were justified. For years, his name resurfaced in the headlines, linked to more violence, more crimes, more pain. He had not changed. He had not reformed. He had only grown older, colder, more bitter. And then, in 1997, the news Mary had dreaded became reality. Singleton struck again. This time, it was another woman. This time, he finished what he had once tried to do to Mary. For Mary, hearing those headlines was like being cut open all over again. She had tried to warn the world. She had tried to tell them he was not safe. And now, another life had been stolen because no one listened. The outrage that followed was massive. Newspapers reminded readers of Mary Vincent's story, of the teenager who had crawled out of a canyon and sketched her attacker from a hospital bed. They asked the same question millions were thinking: why was he ever released at all? For Mary, the anger was not just at Singleton. It was at the system that had given him the chance to harm again. And yet, through it all, she continued to rise. She continued to create art, to raise her children, to inspire survivors everywhere. Mary Vincent had faced the monster once. She had faced the fear of his release. And now, she faced the bitter truth that justice, in her case, had failed. But Mary did not fail. Her story became a rallying cry, proof that laws needed to change, that victims' voices needed to be louder, that survival was not enough. We needed protection too. When Lawrence Singleton was finally locked away again, it was too late to save the woman he had killed. But it was not too late to remember Mary Vincent, the survivor who had warned the world, and the woman who refused to let fear silence her. Mary's life had been marked by violence, but it was defined by something far greater: the courage to live, to speak, and to fight for a world where survival wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of change. For years, Mary Vincent had been defined by what had been taken from her: the girl without arms, the teenager who survived the canyon, the victim who pointed at her attacker in court. But Mary was never content to be remembered only for her pain. She wanted more. She deserved more. In her early 20s, Mary began to find a new kind of strength, not just in surviving, but in living. She discovered that art, the thing she had loved as a child, could become her way of reclaiming herself. At first, drawing with prosthetic hooks felt impossible. The lines were shaky, the pressure uneven, the frustration unbearable. But Mary, who had once crawled her way out of a canyon with nothing but willpower, refused to stop. She practiced for hours, forcing her hands of steel to do what her real hands once had. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Her sketches came alive. Her portraits carried a depth of emotion that words could not capture. Every drawing was raw, filled with truth, with pain, but also with hope. She poured her soul onto the page, and in those drawings, she found healing. Art became her language, a language that did not require arms, only heart. But art wasn't the only thing Mary rebuilt. She also built a family. She fell in love, she had children, and for the first time since 1978, she felt a sense of normalcy returning to her world. Being a mother gave her strength in ways she had never imagined. Every time she looked at her children, she was reminded of why she had chosen to survive in the first place. Still, Motherhood was not easy. How do you cradle a baby with steel hooks? How do you change diapers, prepare bottles, or hold a child close when your body has been reshaped by violence? Mary found a way. She always found a way. Her children grew up knowing their mother was different, but they also grew up knowing their mother was extraordinary. They saw her courage, her creativity, her determination. They saw a woman who had been broken but refused to stay broken. And through it all, Mary never stopped inspiring others. Survivors of violence wrote to her, thanking her for her bravery. Communities invited her to share her story, to stand before crowds and show them that even the deepest wounds could be healed. Each time she spoke, people cried, not just for what she had endured, but for the strength she carried. Mary Vincent, once a runaway teenager nearly erased from the world, had become something much greater, a voice for survival. But even as she thrived, the shadows of her past followed her. The release of Singleton, his crimes years later, the reminders that the system had failed her, they never fully disappeared. Trauma has a way of echoing through time. There were days when the weight of it all felt crushing, when her prosthetics pinched her skin, when the memories came rushing back, when the headlines reminded her of the monster she had once escaped. And yet, she kept moving forward. One of Mary's most powerful acts of resilience was refusing to hide her scars. Many people in her position might have covered them, avoided attention, stayed out of sight. But Mary stood tall, prosthetics in full view, daring the world to look. Not with pity, but with respect. Her scars were not symbols of weakness. They were proof of survival. By the 1990s, Mary Vincent was no longer just a name from a courtroom headline. She was an artist, a mother, and a survivor whose story was carried in classrooms, in documentaries, in whispered conversations about resilience. People didn't just remember her for what she had lost. They remembered her for what she refused to give up, her will to live. And that, perhaps, is the greatest twist of her story. Because Lawrence Singleton thought he had taken everything from her. He thought he had silenced her, erased her, buried her in a canyon of fear. But in reality, all he did was give the world a story it would never forget. Mary Vincent's life was not defined by him. It was defined by her, by the way she learned to write again, by the way she cradled her children with metal hooks, by the way she painted beauty out of pain, by the way she refused to let fear control her. Yes, her past followed her, but so did her strength. And in that strength, millions found hope. Mary Vincent had rebuilt a life from ashes. And in doing so, she had proven that even the darkest chapters can give birth to light. By the mid-1990s, Mary Vincent was finally beginning to breathe again. She had her children, her art, her life rebuilt brick by brick. The world still remembered her story, but in her private world, she wanted to be more than the survivor on the front page. She wanted peace. But peace has a cruel way of shattering when shadows return. In 1997, nearly 2 decades after her attack, the headlines once again carried a name Mary had prayed she would never hear again: Lawrence Singleton. The story spread quickly. Singleton, the man who had once been called the monster of California, the man who had cut off Mary's arms and left her for dead, had killed again. This time, another woman. This time, the nightmare had no survivor. For Mary, hearing those words was like falling back into that canyon. She had fought so hard to build a life, to move forward, but suddenly the past crashed into her present. She wasn't just angry, she was devastated. Because she had known this would happen. She had felt it in her bones. She had warned anyone who would listen. And now, the system that had released him early, the system that had given him a second chance, was responsible for another woman's death. The outrage was immediate. Newspapers reminded the public of Mary Vincent, the 15-year-old girl who had crawled out of a canyon, who had drawn her attacker's face with her toes, who had stood in a courtroom to testify. They called her the girl who had warned the world, and the world finally listened. Mary Vincent became more than a survivor. She became a symbol of resilience, yes, but also of everything broken in the justice system. Politicians, activists, and ordinary citizens looked at her story and demanded change. They asked the questions Mary had been asking for years. How can a man so dangerous be given freedom? How can a sentence so short be justice? How many more lives will it take before we learn? But for Mary, this was not about politics. It was personal. Another woman's life had been stolen because the world had not believed her. The same system that had given her attacker freedom had taken someone else's daughter, someone else's sister, someone else's mother. And Mary had to live with the knowledge that her own suffering had not been enough to prevent it. Still, even in her grief, Mary Vincent did what she had always done. She kept moving forward. She refused to let Singleton's shadow consume her completely. Instead, she spoke louder. She became an advocate, not just for herself, but for survivors everywhere. She stood in front of audiences and told her story, not to shock, but to warn, not to dwell on the past, but to fight for a better future. She told people the truth. Survival is not the end. Survivors need protection, need justice, need a system that values their safety more than a criminal's second chance. And slowly, her voice began to spark change. Laws were debated. Sentencing reforms were considered. Singleton's case became a rallying cry for tougher punishments for violent crimes. Mary Vincent, once a 15-year-old runaway lost on the side of a highway, was now shaping the very laws of the country. But advocacy came with a price. Every time she told her story, she reopened her own wounds. Every time she stood at a podium and spoke of 1978, she relived the canyon, the van, the terror. It was a burden few could carry. And yet, she carried it. For herself, for the woman lost in 1997, and for every survivor whose voice had been silenced. In the end, Lawrence Singleton was finally imprisoned again, this time with no chance of freedom. But for Mary, there was no celebration. Justice delayed is not justice delivered. The damage had already been done. The twist of fate was bitter. The very system that had failed her had failed again. And yet, Mary Vincent stood tall in the ruins, reminding the world that survivors do not exist to be pitied. They exist to be heard. And if the world had listened to Mary the first time, another life might have been saved. But this, too, is part of her legacy. Not just survival, not just resilience, but the courage to turn personal tragedy into a public warning and the determination to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence. Mary Vincent had crawled out of a canyon once. Now, she was pulling an entire nation out of its complacency. On the outside, Mary Vincent seemed unshakable. A woman who had walked away from death, who raised children with steel hooks, who stood before crowds and spoke with clarity and courage. To the world, she was strength itself. But inside, Mary carried battles no one could see. Trauma is not a single event. It is a shadow that follows you, whispering when the room grows quiet, pulling you back to moments you wish you could forget. For Mary, the canyon never fully disappeared. Even years later, a smell, a sound, the sight of a van driving down the street, any of it could drag her back to that night in 1978. There were nights when she woke up trembling, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as if she were once again running for her life. There were mornings when exhaustion weighed heavier than her prosthetics, when simply getting out of bed felt like a fight. And yet, Mary fought. Her children became her anchor. She would look at their faces and remind herself, "This is why I survived. This is why I cannot give up." But even motherhood, as beautiful as it was, came with its own pain. Mary worried constantly. Would her children one day be victims too? Would the world be as cruel to them as it had been to her? She hovered. She protected. She carried the invisible burden of fear that many survivors know all too well. To cope, Mary returned again and again to art. With every sketch, she poured her fears onto paper. Her drawings were often dark, filled with shadows and sharp lines, but they were also alive, alive with emotion, alive with truth. She once said that art was the only place where she felt free, the only place where the memories could be reshaped into something she controlled, not something that controlled her. And slowly, her art began to speak louder than words. Galleries displayed her pieces. Survivors saw themselves in her work. Strangers stood before her drawings and cried, not because of the tragedy, but because of the strength they revealed. Mary Vincent, the girl who had once been left for dead, had become an artist whose creations carried the weight of survival. But her voice did not stop at the canvas. She spoke publicly, not for fame, not for recognition, but because she knew that silence was dangerous. Every time she shared her story, another survivor in the audience found the courage to share theirs. Every time she stood on a stage, someone in the crowd decided they, too, would keep fighting. Mary's pain had become fuel, not just for her own healing, but for the healing of others. Still, the silent battles never left her. Mary faced endless medical complications from her prosthetics, endless adjustments and surgeries. Her body ached with the toll of survival. Insurance struggles and financial hardship only added to the weight she carried. The world saw her strength, but few saw the nights when she cried quietly, wishing for just a moment of the life she had before 1978. But that is what makes Mary's story extraordinary. She was not superhuman. She was not immune to pain. She was a woman who hurt, who doubted, who feared. And yet, she never stopped. That is where her power lived. Not in pretending she was unbreakable, but in showing the world that you can be broken and still rise. Her children, as they grew older, came to understand this about their mother. They saw that her scars were not weaknesses, but reminders of how fiercely she had fought to be there for them. They saw the way she created beauty from pain, the way she stood tall even when fear tried to drag her back down. And they carried that lesson with them. That survival is not just about escaping death. It is about choosing life every single day, even when it hurts. Mary Vincent's life was proof that resilience is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let pain define you. And while the world remembered her for the night she was left in a canyon, her true legacy was written in the years after, in the way she lived, in the way she gave others permission to heal. Mary had survived the monster, but her greatest victory was surviving herself, her fears, her doubts, her memories. Because in the end, the most dangerous battles are the ones no one else can see. And Mary Vincent fought those battles every day of her life. By the late 1990s, Mary Vincent was no longer just a survivor. She had become a living reminder of everything that needed to change. Her name carried weight, not just in courtrooms, but in conversations about justice, safety, and survival across America. The media could not tell the story of sentencing reform without invoking her. Legislators could not debate violent crime laws without recalling her testimony, her drawing, her survival. And communities could not speak about resilience without remembering the 15-year-old girl who had crawled out of a canyon with no arms, refusing to die. Mary's case was cited again and again as an example of how the justice system had failed. The outrage over Lawrence Singleton's short sentence fueled campaigns for tougher laws. Lawmakers pointed to Mary's story when arguing for true life sentences for violent offenders, ensuring that no one like Singleton could walk free after only a handful of years. It was as if her suffering had become a mirror held up to the nation, forcing America to look at the cracks in its foundation. But what made Mary extraordinary was not just that her case changed laws. It was that she changed hearts. When she spoke at schools, teenagers listened with rapt attention, their chatter silenced by the weight of her words. When she stood before survivors groups, women and men who had carried their own traumas felt seen, heard, and validated. Mary had endured the unimaginable, and in her survival, they found proof that healing was possible. She was not a politician. She was not a lawyer. She was not someone who sought power or titles. She was simply a woman who refused to be silenced. And that refusal gave others permission to speak. Journalists described her as soft-spoken yet powerful, someone whose presence alone carried a gravity that silenced rooms. People expected to see weakness in her prosthetic hooks, but instead, they saw fire in her eyes. They saw defiance. They saw the human spirit unbroken. And perhaps the most powerful part of her story was how ordinary she remained. She was a mother juggling bills, a woman painting late into the night, someone who struggled with pain and trauma just like anyone else. That ordinariness made her even more extraordinary, because she proved that heroes do not wear capes. Sometimes they wear scars. As the years passed, Mary Vincent's influence stretched far beyond California. Her story was told in documentaries, written in articles, studied in universities as a case that revealed both the brutality of crime and the resilience of the human will. She became a touchstone in conversations about victims' rights, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her survival demanded to be remembered. For victims who felt invisible, Mary was proof that their voices mattered. For communities that doubted survivors, Mary was undeniable. For lawmakers who claimed the system was strong enough, Mary was living evidence that it was not. But even as her story became larger than life, Mary never let herself be reduced to a symbol alone. She reminded people that behind the headlines was a human being who still struggled, who still fought silent battles, who still woke some nights gripped by fear. She wanted the world to know that survivors are not statistics. They are people, and that, perhaps, was her greatest contribution, not just changing laws, but changing how people thought about survival. Mary Vincent proved that survival is not about erasing trauma. It is about carrying it, facing it, and still choosing to live. She showed that being a victim and being powerful are not contradictions. They are two sides of the same truth. In the end, Mary's life became more than her own. It became a story the nation carried forward, a reminder whispered in the halls of justice, a lesson passed from survivor to survivor. You are not alone. You are not powerless. You are not defined by what was taken from you. And for Mary Vincent, that was the legacy she had never asked for, but one she carried with pride. Because in the face of a world that had tried to erase her, she had become unforgettable. By the time Mary Vincent entered her 40s and 50s, she had already lived more lives than most people ever could. A runaway teenager, a victim of unimaginable cruelty, a survivor who crawled out of death, a mother, an artist, an advocate, a symbol. But when you asked Mary who she was, she never defined herself by what was taken. She defined herself by what she built. Her children were grown now, each carrying within them the lessons of resilience their mother had lived every day. They had seen her sketch with hooks, cook with hooks, hug with hooks. They had seen her cry. They had seen her laugh. They had seen her stumble and rise again. And they knew, without a doubt, that their mother was extraordinary. For Mary, that was the legacy that mattered most. Not the headlines, not the documentaries, not the laws that bore traces of her story. What mattered most was that her children knew her not just as the girl in the canyon, but as the woman who refused to let the canyon be her grave. Still, as she entered her later years, reflection came often. Sometimes, Mary would sit in her studio, surrounded by her art, and think about the strange path her life had taken. She had not chosen this story. She had not chosen to be remembered for survival. And yet, she had embraced it. Not because she wanted fame, but because silence would have been another kind of death. Looking back, she knew the hardest part had never been the canyon, or the surgeries, or even the courtroom. The hardest part had been learning to live with the memories, the silent battles within, the constant need to push against fear. And yet, she had won those battles over and over. Mary often said that survival is not a single event. It is a choice you make every morning when you open your eyes. It is choosing to live, even when it hurts. choosing to hope, even when fear whispers louder, choosing to believe, even when the world feels broken. And that choice, she believed, was her true legacy. In her later years, Mary's art carried a softer tone, still powerful, still emotional, but filled with more light than shadow. Her canvases held images of growth, of renewal, of resilience. She painted hands, not because she longed for her own, but because they symbolized connection, the thing she valued most. Her exhibitions drew crowds who knew her story, but they came to see more than tragedy. They came to see the beauty she had created out of pain. And Mary, standing beside her work, smiled. Not the smile of someone who had forgotten, but the smile of someone who had triumphed. When asked how she wanted to be remembered, Mary's answer was simple. Not as the girl who lost her arms, not as the victim of a monster, not even as the survivor who changed laws. She wanted to be remembered as a woman who refused to disappear. Because disappearing, that was what her attacker wanted. That was what fear demanded. And that was what she had fought against every day since 1978. Her legacy was not survival alone. Her legacy was resilience, motherhood, art, advocacy. Her legacy was the lives she touched, the survivors she inspired, the children she raised, the people who looked at her and found courage in their own darkest moments. In the end, Mary Vincent's story was never about death. It was always about life. The life she clawed back from the canyon. The life she built with steel hooks and unstoppable determination. The life she gave to her children, her community, her art. Her story was proof that even the most violent attempt to erase someone can fail. Proof that strength is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to surrender to it. Proof that no matter how dark the night, survival can carve a path back to the light. Mary Vincent had been broken, but she had never been defeated. And that, she believed, was how she would be remembered. Not as a victim, not as a headline, but as a woman who turned ashes into art, fear into fuel, and survival into legacy. Mary Vincent's story is one of those rare human tales that refuse to fade with time. It began on the side of a California highway, where a runaway teenager accepted what she thought was a ride to safety. It descended into horror in a canyon where she should have died. And it rose, against every odd, into a life defined not by loss, but by resilience. Decades later, her name still carries weight. Her story is still told, not because of the cruelty she endured, but because of the courage she embodied. When people speak of Mary, they don't talk only about the night of 1978. They talk about the girl who sketched her attacker from a hospital bed. They talk about the young woman who learned to cook, to paint, to mother children with steel hooks. They talk about the survivor who stood in front of lawmakers and demanded justice. Mary Vincent is not remembered for being broken. She is remembered for refusing to break. In a world that often forgets victims, Mary refused to be forgotten. In a society that often silences survivors, she refused to be silent. She turned pain into art, fear into advocacy, scars into symbols. And in doing so, she became larger than her story. She became proof. Proof that survival is possible. Proof that resilience is stronger than cruelty. Proof that even when darkness tries to erase someone, light can carve its way back. Think about it. In that canyon, alone, bleeding, abandoned, Mary could have given up. No one would have blamed her. No one would have expected her to keep crawling. But she did. She chose life. She chose to rise. She chose to fight. And that choice echoes far beyond 1978. It echoes every time a survivor hears her story and decides not to give up. It echoes every time a community demands justice because her case showed them the cost of failure. It echoes every time someone looks at their scars, visible or invisible, and realizes those scars are not the end of their story. Mary Vincent's life reminds us of something vital. Survival is not about what happens to you. It is about what you choose afterward. She chose to live. She chose to create. She chose to raise children who knew strength firsthand. She chose to turn her life into a beacon so that others could find their way through their own darkness. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all is this: Mary Vincent did not survive for herself alone. She survived for everyone who needed to believe that survival was possible. So when we look at that photograph of her in 1978, standing, smiling, her arms replaced by steel hooks, we are not looking at tragedy. We are looking at triumph. We are looking at defiance. We are looking at a 15-year-old girl who refused to disappear, and a woman who carried that refusal for the rest of her life. Mary's story does not leave us comfortable. It does not allow us to look away. It forces us to confront cruelty, yes, but also to confront resilience. To confront the truth that the human spirit, even when shattered, can rise again. And in that truth, we find hope. Because if Mary Vincent could crawl out of that canyon, if she could rebuild her life, if she could stand in front of the world and smile after everything she endured, then maybe, just maybe, we can face our own battles with the same courage. Mary Vincent did not choose what happened to her, but she chose what came after. She chose life. She chose strength. She chose to be remembered not as a victim, but as a survivor. And that is why her story will never fade. Because Mary Vincent refused to disappear.